From New York, this is Democracy Now!
There are people entering college today, people entering the U.S. military today, who in their lifetime have not seen a day when the United States has not been at war. The United States has been at war continually since 2001 in, again, no fewer than 22 countries.
As the United States marks the 19th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we look at how the U.S. global war on terror has displaced at least 37 million people since 2001. We'll talk to David Vine, author of The United States of War, a global history of America's endless conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. Then we speak to the legendary Black feminist scholar and organizer Barbara Smith on her new plan to combat white supremacy and why she named it after Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker.
I thought it was important to write about the problem of white supremacy, given the level of racial turmoil that we've experienced during the last few months, and also to propose a plan to end white supremacy, which I have named the Hamer-Baker Plan.
Then, as global deaths from COVID-19 top 910,000, we'll look at the race to develop a vaccine. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Oregon, 500,000 people, or more than 1 out of 10 state residents, have been forced to evacuate their homes as unprecedented wildfires fueled by the climate crisis continue to rage across the western United States. In California, the town of Berry Creek was completely consumed as a wall of fire swept through the community, killing 10 people, leaving another 16 missing. Meanwhile, the August complex fire in Mendocino County has become the largest conflagration in California history at nearly 750 square miles. More than 3 million acres have been burned across California, shattering previous records even before the normal peak of the fire season. This comes as President Trump last spoke publicly about the fires in August and is yet to offer any public statement of support for victims of the blazes. More details have emerged over why AstraZeneca paused its Phase 3 COVID-19 vaccine trial in Britain. During a private call with investors, AstraZeneca's CEO revealed a woman in the trial developed severe neurological symptoms consistent with transverse myelitis, or inflammation of the spinal cord. Details about the phone call were first reported by the medical news site Stat. This comes as the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 is approaching 192,000. On Thursday, the U.S. Department of Labor fined a Smithfield Foods meat processing plant in South Dakota that became an early hotspot for the coronavirus. Nearly 1,300 workers were infected and 43 hospitalized. 4 died. The fine was $13,500. The number of COVID-19 cases globally has topped 28 million, with over 910,000 dead. In Latin America, the total number of cases has topped 8 million, more infections than any other region in the world. India has reported another 96,000 new cases, once again breaking the record for the most new cases in a single day. A number of countries across the globe have reported setting new single-day records for infections, including Greece, France, Hungary, Ukraine, and the occupied Palestinian territories. The Labor Department is reporting another 857,000 people filed for state unemployment insurance last week. In addition, 839,000 people filed claims with a federal program aimed at helping freelancers and others. Meanwhile, Senate Republicans failed to advance a new slimmed-down coronavirus relief package, making it increasingly unlikely a new stimulus bill will be approved before the November election. A new report finds Amazon set prices for essential products during the COVID-19 pandemic at levels that would violate price gouging laws in many U.S. states. Public Citizen reports Amazon marked up some goods by as much as 1,000% over the expected price at a time when millions of people were forced to shop online due to remain-at-home orders. Meanwhile, a new Oxfam report finds Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos could personally pay each of his 876,000 workers a 6-figure bonus and still have more wealth than he controlled at the start of the pandemic. In Philadelphia, 2 encampments for unhoused people remain occupied nearly 2 days after the city ordered the camps to shutter. Residents of the camps are demanding the city invest in more resources for unhoused people, including safe housing during the pandemic. On the campaign trail, Joe Biden said Thursday, if elected president, he might increase military spending even beyond the Pentagon's current record budget of $738 billion. Biden told Stars and Stripes, quote, "We have to focus more on unmanned capacity, cyber and IT, in a very modern world that's changing rapidly," he said. Meanwhile, President Trump campaigned outside Saginaw, Michigan Thursday, where he spoke for 90 minutes to an overwhelmingly white crowd of several thousand supporters who packed shoulder to shoulder into an airport hangar with Air Force One as a backdrop. Red hats vastly outnumbered face masks at Trump's rally, flouting Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's public health orders. Trump also wore no mask. He attacked Joe Biden as a, quote, globalist sellout.
If Biden wins, China wins. If Biden wins, the mob wins. If Biden wins, the rioters, anarchists, arsonists, and flag burners win.
In Portland, Oregon, Mayor Ted Wheeler has ordered his city's police force to stop using tear gas following its widespread use during 105 straight days of protests since the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. A U.S. Army study found tear gas can leave its victims more susceptible to respiratory diseases like COVID-19. Meanwhile, Portland has some of the worst air quality of any major city in the world after a thick shroud of smoke from record wildfires settled over the city. In Washington State, a witness to last week's police killing of Michael Renault says the 48-year-old anti-fascist activist did not appear to have a gun and was not threatening officers before he was killed in a hail of police gunfire. The witness, Nathaniel Dingus, says Renault was clutching his phone and eating candy outside an apartment complex September 3rd when officers in 2 unmarked cars converged on him. Dingus says the officers never announced themselves or gave commands before opening fire. The officers were serving an arrest warrant for Renault over the shooting death of Aaron Danielson, a member of the far-right Patriot Prayer Group who was killed during a protest in Portland August 29th. In Los Angeles, a warning to our audience. The following stories contain graphic footage of police violence. This from Los Angeles. Police fired tear gas and rubber-coated steel bullets to clear demonstrations while arresting 35 people this week as protesters continued to demand justice for Dijon Kizzee, a 29-year-old black bicyclist who was shot dead by police after being pulled over for an alleged bike violation in late August. Protesters want L.A. District Attorney Jackie Lacey to resign and for the officers involved to be fired and criminally prosecuted. ProPublica is reporting 86 high-ranking officers in the New York Police Department have tallied at least one credible misconduct allegation. Assistant Police Chief Christopher McCormick had the most. He was repeatedly promoted even though 15 Black and Latinx men have accused him over the years of invasive body cavity searches and pulling down their pants in public, exposing their genitals. The Houston Police Department has fired 4 officers involved in the fatal shooting of a man suffering a mental health crisis in April. Nicholas Chavez died after police shot him 24 times on April 21st. Calls are growing for Houston and other cities to begin sending mental health professionals, not police officers, to deal with such incidents in the future. In Colombia, at least 8 people were killed and 400 injured as thousands took to the streets of Bogotá Wednesday night protesting police violence following the killing of Javier Ordóñez, a father of 2. A video circulating on social media shows police officers pinning Ordóñez to the ground, repeatedly shocking him with a stun gun for over 10 minutes as Ordóñez begs, "Please, no more." Ordóñez died shortly after in police custody. In Mexico, women have started occupying human rights offices across the country. This comes as feminist groups and family members of women and girls who've been murdered or disappeared have occupied Mexico City's National Human Rights Commission for a week. In the city of Ecatepec, in the state of Mexico. Police attacked and detained protesters at one of the feminist occupations last night. Ecatepec is one of the most dangerous places for women in Mexico. The activists and families are demanding the government do more to end disappearances and investigate cases of femicides. An average of 11 women are killed daily in Mexico, the perpetrators rarely brought to justice. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has frequently dismissed violence against women. This is Yesenia Zamudio, whose 19-year-old daughter was murdered in Mexico City 4 years ago.
We are the families, the real ones, the searchers, the diggers, those who have suffered femicide, rape, the survivors, the real women, those that no one names, that are not shown on the television. We are going to speak about everyone. We are going to guarantee justice for all women, and we demand to live in a country free of violence. It is our right. This occupation will help all women. I told the Secretary of the Interior that if we don't see a solution, we are going to take over the entire country.
In news from Arizona, armed Border Patrol agents arrested 2 land and water defenders Wednesday who attempted to stop construction of the U.S.-Mexico border wall in an area sacred to the O'odham indigenous people. In immigration news, a federal court in New York has blocked the Trump administration from excluding undocumented immigrants from the 2020 census, ruling undocumented people, quote, qualify as persons in a state who must be counted. Advocates call the ruling a victory for voting and immigrant rights. In Greece, officials are sending at least 3 ships to aid some 13,000 people who've been left homeless after a blaze completely incinerated the Moria refugee camp in the Isles of Lesbos early this week. A series of small fires were reportedly lit by refugee youth as a form of protest after the only ATM machine available on site, which the entire refugee camp was dependent on for money, was blocked amidst COVID-19 restrictions, leaving them unable to buy food and hygienic supplies. In Australia, the CEO and other top executives of the mining giant Rio Tinto have stepped down over their role in demolishing a 46,000-year-old archaeological site. Last month, Chief Executive Jean-Sébastien Jacques acknowledged his company used dynamite to blow up ancient Aboriginal caves in order to get at millions of dollars worth of iron ore. He was forced to resign after massive public outcry. Back in the United States, an indigenous water protector who was arrested during protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline has been released from federal prison. Prosecutors accused Red Fawn-Fallis of firing 3 shots from a handgun as police in riot gear wielding batons surrounded her to make an arrest amidst mass protests against the pipeline in 2016. Red Fawn's uncle, Glenn Morris, welcomed her release Thursday, telling Indian Country Today, quote, the real criminals continue to pump oil through the pipeline in violation of the 1851 and 1868 Fort Laramie treaties and U.S. environmental laws, he said. And the NFL season got underway Thursday night in Kansas City, where the defending Super Bowl champions defeated the Houston Texans before a crowd of about 17,000, the limit set by coronavirus restrictions. Ahead of the game, Kansas City players joined arms with their opponents on the field in what players billed as a moment of silence dedicated to the ongoing fight for equality in our country. Much of the crowd erupted in boos during the players' demonstration. Kansas City Councilmember Eric Bunch responded on Twitter, quote, some NFL fans booing the players for standing and locking arms in a moment of silent unity proves that for them, standing for the flag was always about perpetuating white supremacy, unquote. This comes as Miami Dolphins players said they would remain inside their locker room this season for the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner, as well as the NFL's new addition to pre-game ceremonies, Lift Every Voice and Sing, often referred to as the Black National Anthem. This is an excerpt from a video released by Dolphins teammates Thursday.
So if my dad was a soldier, but the cops killed my brother, do I stand for one anthem and then kneel for the other?
This attempt to unify only creates more divide.
So we'll skip this song and dance.
And as a team, we'll stay inside.
This week, former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick returned to the NFL, but only in virtual form. Kaepernick was added to the 2021 version of the popular Madden NFL video game. He has remained unsigned by NFL teams since 2017 after leading protests against police brutality and racism during the 2016 season. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. It's been 19 years since the coordinated attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and United Airlines Flight 93 killed nearly 3,000 people. At 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time, the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center here in New York City. Today, President Trump and Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden will both visit the Flight 93 National Memorial near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at different times. Biden will also pay respects after attending a 9/11 memorial ceremony in New York, which Vice President Pence will also attend. Today, the United States faces a terror of a different kind, as more than 191,000 people have died from the COVID-19 pandemic, and a new report projects the U.S. death toll could rise to as high as 3,000 people per day by December. There were more than 1,200 new deaths in the U.S. in the last 24 hours. Time magazine plans to mark the approaching milestone of 200,000 COVID-related deaths in the U.S. with a cover that reads, "An American Failure," and has a black border for only the second time in its history. The first time was after 9/11. This comes as a new report finds the U.S.-led so-called global war on terrorism has displaced at least 37 million people in 8 countries since 2001. The Cost of War Project at Brown University has also estimated more than 800,000 people in U.S.-led war since 2001 at a cost of $6.4 trillion to U.S. taxpayers. The new report is titled Creating Refugees, Displacement Caused by the United States Post-9/11 Wars. For more, we're joined by its co-author, David Vine, professor of anthropology at American University. His new book is out next month called The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. He's also author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. David Vine, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you back with us, although this is a very sad day on this 19th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Can you talk about the findings of your report?
Sure. Thank you, Amy, for having me. It's great to be back. The findings of our report are basically asking, the United States has been fighting wars continuously, as you said, for 19 years. We're looking at what the effects of these wars have been. The Cost of War Project has been doing this for about a decade. We wanted to look specifically at how many people had been displaced by these wars. Basically, we found that no one had bothered to investigate how many people had been displaced by the wars in what are now actually at least 24 countries that the United States has been involved in. And we found that in total, at least 37 million people have been displaced in just 8 of the most violent wars that the United States has either launched or participated in since 2001. That's Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and the Philippines. And that's a very conservative estimate. We found that the actual total could be up to 48 to 59 million. And I do think we have to pause on these numbers because we, in many ways, our lives are drowning in numbers about COVID, about many things that are important to track quantitatively, but to wrap one's mind around what just 37 million people displaced is difficult, in fact, and I think it requires some active effort. Certainly did for me. 37 million, to put it in historical perspective, that's more people displaced by any war since at least the beginning of the 20th century, with the exception of World War II. And if our larger, less conservative methodology is accurate, the 48 to 59 million estimate, that is comparable to the displacement one saw in World War II. Another way to try to wrap one's mind around just the 37 million minimum figure, 37 million is about the size of the state of California. Just imagine the entire state of California disappearing, having to flee their homes. It's about the size of all of Canada or Texas and Virginia combined.
And for those enough who are lucky to have homes during this pandemic, I think people particularly appreciate. I mean, the word refugees is thrown around, but what it means to be displaced. Can you talk about why those 8 countries, and can you correlate that with U.S. wars abroad?
Sure. We wanted to focus on the most violent wars that the United States has been involved in, the wars that the United States has most deeply invested money and of course, the blood, the lives of U.S. military personnel, and by extension, the lives that have been affected, the family members of U.S. military personnel and others. We wanted to look specifically at the wars the United States has launched. So the overlapping war in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the war in Iraq, of course, wars that the United States has significantly escalated, Libya and Syria, and Syria along with European and other allies, and then wars the United States has participated in significantly in ways including providing battlefield advisors, providing fuel, arms, and others in Yemen, Somalia, and the Philippines. In each of these wars, we have found displacement numbering in the millions. And indeed, I think, we have to recognize that displacement, the need to flee one's home, to flee for one's life, there's in many ways, there's no way to calculate what that means for a single individual, a single family, a single community. But we did feel it was important to look at the total mass displacement that these wars have caused. It is important to note, we are not saying the United States is solely to blame for this level of displacement. Clearly, there are other actors, other governments, other combatants who are important in the responsibility they bear for displacement in these wars. Assad in Syria, Sunni and Shia militias in Iraq, the Taliban, of course, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, others, U.S. allies, including Britain, also bear some responsibility. But the United States has played a disproportionate role in waging war, in launching war, and in perpetuating war over the last 19 years. And as you pointed out, this has cost U.S. taxpayers, U.S. citizens, U.S. residents in other ways, including the 6.4 trillion, and that's trillion with a T, $6.4 trillion that the cost of war project is estimated the United States has either spent or obligated already, and that total is, of course, increasing by the day.
And David Vine, the number of refugees the U.S. accepts from these wars, whose displacement the U.S. is causing?
Yeah, and we can look at the fire in Lesbos that you referred to earlier that has displaced some 13,000 people, a refugee camp on Lesbos that's been totally destroyed. And I would hope that people looking at the fires in California and Oregon and Washington could more easily empathize with the refugees in Lesbos and the refugees throughout the greater Middle East in particular, where fires, essentially one large fire has been burning since October 2001 when the U.S. launched its war in Afghanistan.
I wanted to turn to President Trump earlier this week, telling reporters top Pentagon officials don't like him because he wants to get the U.S. out of endless wars that benefit weapons manufacturers.
Biden shipped away our jobs, threw open our borders, and sent our youth to fight in these crazy, endless wars. And it's one of the reasons the military, I'm not saying the military is in love with me, the soldiers are. The top people in the Pentagon probably aren't, because they want to do nothing but fight wars so that all of those wonderful companies that make the bombs and make the planes and make everything else stay happy. But we're getting out of the endless wars.
It sounds a little like, well, if Howard Zinn were alive, what he would say. But Trump's criticism of the military-industrial complex contradicts his own record of overseeing this historic increase in war spending in the defense budget, in spending on military equipment, selling weapons overseas. Politico recently called Trump the booster-in-chief of defense contractors. Last year, Trump bypassed Congress so he could sell $8 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. Earlier this year, his administration ordered a reinterpretation of a Cold War-era arms treaty in order to pave the way for drone sales to go to governments that have previously been barred from such purchases. Can you respond to what he said?
In many ways, what Trump said is quite rich, so to speak. Indeed, he is correct that weapons manufacturers have benefited greatly to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, in addition to other infrastructure contractors, the companies that make military bases that now dot the Middle East. But, you know, Trump, indeed, as Politico said, is the booster-in-chief. He has overseen and pushed for military budgets that exceed those at the height of the Cold War. And I think we have to ask, you know, what are the enemies the United States faces today that require a military budget of this size? Does the United States need to be spending upwards of $740 billion a year to defend itself? Could we be spending this money in better ways to defend ourselves? And what needs, drastic, dramatic, pressing needs, human needs, are being neglected because we are pouring tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into this war machine on a yearly basis? And I think COVID, of course, points to this, underlines it more than ever. The United States was not prepared for a pandemic. And this is in no small part because the United States has been pouring money into this war machine while neglecting human needs in the United States and around the world, healthcare needs, pandemic preparedness, affordable housing, the environment. This money that we've been pouring into the war machine, of course, could have been addressing the global warming that one sees, that plays some role in the fires one seeing across the West Coast, among many other pressing needs that the world faces today.
This is one amazing fact you've pointed out, David Vine. The U.S. military has waged war, engaged in combat, or otherwise invaded foreign lands in all but 11 years of its existence.
That's right. The past 19 years of war, many people often see it as exceptional, as strange that, you know, people entering college today, or most people enlisting in the U.S. military today, will not have seen a day of their life, or will not have no memory of a day of their life when the United States was not at war. In fact, this is the norm in U.S. history. And the Congressional Research Service shows this on a yearly basis in a report that you can find online. This is not just me, although I have a list of the wars expanding on the Congressional Research Service list. These are wars and other forms of combat that the United States has engaged in since independence. And indeed, in 95% of the years in U.S. history, all but 11 years in U.S. history, the United States has been involved in some form of war or other combat. And one needs to look at this much longer-term trend, this longer-term pattern that extends beyond the war, the so-called war on terror that George W. Bush launched in 2001, to understand why the United States has poured so much money into these wars, and why the effects of these wars have been so horrific for the people involved.
David Vine, you report in your forthcoming book, The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State, that U.S. bases abroad enable combat in 24 countries, quote, thousands of U.S. military bases in nearly 100 foreign countries and territories, more than half of them built since 2001, have enabled the involvement of U.S. military forces in wars and other combat deployments across at least 24 nations since the George W. Bush administration launched its war on terror, so-called, following the September 11, 2001 attacks.
Indeed, the United States currently has about 800 military bases in around 80 foreign countries and territories. And this is more bases than any nation in world history. The United States has, as you alluded to, had even larger numbers of bases. At the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were upwards of 2,000 bases abroad. And part of what my book, The United States of War, shows is that this is also a long-term pattern. The United States has been building military bases abroad since independence, initially on the lands of Native American peoples, and then increasingly outside of North America, and eventually encircling the globe, particularly after World War II. And what I show is that these bases have not only enabled war, they've not only made war possible, but they've actually made war more likely. It's made war a far too easy policy choice decision for powerful decision makers, leaders, politicians, corporate leaders, and others. And we need to basically dismantle this infrastructure of war that the United States has built up. Why does the United States have dozens of military bases in the Middle East, in virtually every country outside of Yemen and Iran? These bases, of course, are in countries that are led by undemocratic regimes, not spreading democracy, far from it, in many cases actually blocking the spread of democracy, and making these wars possible that I think it's important to underline again, beyond displacing 37 million people at least, and perhaps up to 59 million people, these wars have taken the lives of, as the Cost of War Project has shown, around 800,000 people. And this is just in 5 of the wars: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. The United States U.S. combat has taken the lives of around 800,000 people. But there are also indirect deaths that have been caused by the destruction of local infrastructure, healthcare services, hospitals, food sources. And those total deaths could number upwards of 3 million people. And I think most people in the United States, again, myself included, have not really reckoned with the total damage that these wars have caused. And we haven't even begun to wrap our minds around what it would mean to have this level of destruction in our lives.
And you have, for example, the effects of soldiers on bases, like what happened in the Philippines, where the authoritarian leader, President Duterte, just pardoned a U.S. soldier who was found guilty of murdering a trans woman off a base.
Yes, this is another cost of war. We need to look at the costs of war in terms of the human costs, in terms of direct combat deaths, injuries in these wars, the wars on terror, numbering in the tens of millions. But we also need to look at the deaths and injuries that are caused on a daily basis around U.S. military bases around the world. These bases have, in addition to enabling the wars that the United States has been fighting, they have very immediate harms that they inflict on local populations, including in the Philippines and in, as I said, around 80 countries and territories around the world. Well, damage to their environments, their local communities, in a whole variety of ways.
David Vine, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Professor of Anthropology at American University, co-author of the new report on the Costs of War Project, headlined Creating Refugees, Displacement Caused by the United States Post-9/11 Wars. Your new book coming out, The United States of War. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in 30 seconds with the African-American scholar and icon Barbara Smith, as we look at the issue of terrorism at home, as we look at the threat of white supremacist violence. Stay with us.
No es anillo que brilla en la mano, no es el príncipe para los gitanos, no es la espada para el mosquetero, no es enigma para el hechicero, no, 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 no me gusta, no, no me gusta, no, no lo quiero, no, no lo quiero, no, no me gusta, no, no lo quiero, no, no. Me hace mal verlo todos los días, me molesta su sonrisa fría, me incomoda su literatura, me deprime su minicultura.
Chilean singer Isabel Parra. This is Democracy Now!, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now from the cost of the so-called war on terror abroad to look at how the U.S. government is targeting Black Lives Matter protesters while downplaying the threat of white supremacist violence at home. Since the police killing of George Floyd in May sparked a nationwide uprising against police brutality, armed white supremacists have taken to the streets of U.S. cities in response to Black Lives Matter protests. After the police shooting of unarmed black father Jake Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, 17-year-old white Trump-supporting vigilante gunman Kyle Rittenhouse shot and killed 2 anti-racist protesters in Kenosha last month. But President Trump has refused to criticize Rittenhouse. Just this week, Donald Trump Jr. said of the self-proclaimed vigilante, quote, "We all do stupid things at 17. On Wednesday, a Department of Homeland Security whistleblower accused the agency's leadership of instructing analysts to downplay the violent threat posed by white supremacists. Brian Murphy, the former head of the Homeland Security Department's intelligence branch, says he'd been ordered to alter the text of assessments to make the threat of white supremacy, quote, appear less severe. Earlier this year, DHS drafted a document stating, quote, white supremacist extremists will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland through 2021. That's not a Black Lives Matter manual. Again, that is DHS's own words. But in newer versions of the document, the reference to white supremacists was removed. Murphy also claims leaders at DHS pressured analysts to change assessments to match up to comments made by President Trump attacking anti-fascist groups. This comes as The Intercept reports in many states protesters who took part in the massive Black Lives Matter demonstrations are being charged with felonies and even terrorism. Well, for more, we're joined by a guest who's proposing a Marshall Plan to eradicate white supremacy in the United States. She calls it the Hamer-Baker Plan for Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. Barbara Smith joins us now from Albany, New York, an author, activist, independent scholar, founder of the Combahee River Collective and of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press. Her latest book, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. Her recent piece for The Nation headlined How to Dismantle White Supremacy. Barbara Smith, welcome back to Democracy Now! As we talk about terrorism, talk about what we see in the United States.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be with you again, Amy. I actually was talking about something a bit different from what you just so very clearly framed in your introduction. I'm not just talking about white supremacist groups or organized white supremacy. What I'm talking about is a system that actually dictates and shapes every aspect of life in the United States, from where your kids go to school and what kind of education they're able to get, what kind of housing you have, what your health care looks like, how often or much more often you die from COVID-19. I'm talking about the entire system. And I think that, of course, if we eradicate white supremacy and make that our priority and our goal, of course, we're going to get rid of the most extreme manifestations of white supremacy, which is organized white supremacist groups, violent terrorist groups. But I'm talking about something even, I think, larger.
So talk about that larger picture and talk about the plan that you see needs to be put in place in this country.
Well, I started writing about white supremacy earlier this summer after George Floyd was lynched. I was so full of rage and pain because I've been dealing with this ever since Emmett Till was lynched in 1955. I was 8 years old when that happened. So, of course, I could not fully understand what had actually transpired. I just knew that the people in my family, who were all from the Deep South, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, because they were part of the Great Migration. I just knew they were very, very upset about someone named Emmett Till, and that this person was also a child like my twin sister, Beverly, and me. So, as I said, I've been dealing with this for quite a long time, 1955 until the spring of 2020 and beyond. So I just thought, I've got to write. I'm a writer. I just thought, I've got to write about this. What motivated me was the fact that when people were talking about these issues, either in print or in media, visual, media, et cetera, that they never really talked about white supremacy. They would talk about race relations. They would talk about implicit bias. They would talk about needing to reform and change the culture of policing. All well and good, but they never talked about where all this mess comes from. And that's what I wanted to write about. In that first article, which appeared in the Boston Globe, it was an op-ed in the Boston Globe, I proposed, what would it be like if we had a Marshall Plan, or a plan on the scale of the space race to eradicate white supremacy? And when I was in contact then with my editor at The Nation, they suggested, why don't you spin that out? And that's where the second article evolved from.
And talk about Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, why you've named this plan after them.
Well, it's, as I say, when people ask me, it's because I idolize them. And they are supreme examples of what being freedom fighters, principled, fearless, or at least courageous. There's a difference between being fearless and being courageous. Courageous is actually better because everyone should have some fear about what might actually harm them. And of course, Fannie Lou Hamer paid a huge price for wanting to do something as seemingly ordinary as vote. But in the Jim Crow South of that era, Black people, virtually none of them were allowed to vote. She paid a permanent price because of the beating that she received. And I just found out yesterday, if you can believe it, after all these years, that she actually was blinded in one eye. She is known for having worked with SNCC, doing voter organizing and other kinds of, anti-racist organizing during that Jim Crow era. And then, of course, speaking out so powerfully at the 1964 Democratic Convention about what went on in Mississippi and asking the very, very, very relevant question, is this America? And then Ella Baker, of course, she was a person, among so many other things, she worked for all of the major civil rights organizations at some time. So she had experience across organizations. She also was doing that grassroots, very, very dangerous organizing in the Jim Crow South, in little towns, in rural areas. But she is probably best known for the person who inspired and made possible the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is SNCC. I actually had the great, great pleasure and honor of meeting Fannie Lou Hamer when I was a teenager in Cleveland in 1965 and was very involved in the civil rights movement as a young person.
Barbara Smith, can you talk about why you feel racial capitalism and what you think that term means should be at the center of this plan?
Well, as you know, Amy, you can't talk about race in the United States without talking about class, and you can't talk about class without talking about race. Racism, white supremacy, capitalism are absolutely intertwined. It's like a vine that has wrapped itself around a tree or another plant. What can you do to separate them? Very, very, very difficult to do. We have and live under a system of racialized capitalism where the worst consequences of capitalism fall upon those who have the least amount of white skin privilege. In other words, people of color. And that's why we see such disproportionate economic results and consequences of that system. The fact that Black families have about 10% of the wealth, the median wealth of white families, just says it all.
I want to go back to 1968, to the Kerner Commission, which offered a moment that could have launched the U.S. into a massive program to end white supremacy, but didn't. Why do you think that didn't happen during the civil rights movement? And what do you think is necessary to make this sort of national shift now?
Again, getting into the Wayback Machine of my memory and of my life, I remember when the Kerner Commission report came out. I remember buying my paperback copy. It was a best-selling book. And that's when people had, like read paperbacks. You didn't have the internet or, all these other means of communication. So the pocket book, as they call them, the paperback book that was the format. And this is a big, thick, but small, size report done by a government bipartisan commission to explain, to investigate, explain, analyze why there had been so many urban insurrections, rebellions. I never call them riots. The other people can call them riots, but why there had been so many urban insurrections during that period of the late 1960s. And they came up with the incredibly insightful conclusion that it was white racism. And I would say that the reason that it was not addressed at that time is because, and this may sound, like pessimistic, but it's not. It's just something for us to think about. This country functions with white supremacy as its engine, an engine that runs so many aspects: banking, healthcare, education, all these disparities that we see. It would take quite a bit to say, I think, we need to get rid of that. And that's where we are now. Do we have the political will to actually eradicate white supremacy, or do we just want to kind of nip around the edges of it and do cosmetic things, taking down the Confederate statues? Very, very important. Very glad that's happening. But it doesn't necessarily get to the material conditions of people who live under this system, nor does it address the incredible violent racism that results in people like Jacob Blake being shot 7 times in front of his tiny children at point blank range.
And as you speak, Barbara, it just so happens that these seconds, people hear it at different times, but at this time, 8:46, the first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center 19 years ago. I wanted to ask you about intersectionality, about taking on terrorism, taking on white supremacy. You say it can't be divorced from misogyny and heteropatriarchy.
Right. Well, that's, certainly from my long years of commitment to fighting for women's rights and women's freedom, and also being an out lesbian since the 1970s. Like how on businesses they say things like serving you since 1942 or whatever. Well, if there was a little sign, to explain that aspect of my life, it would be out lesbian since 1975. So that's a long time, and that was not very long after Stonewall. So I've been involved in thinking about, organizing around, writing about issues of sexuality and gender, and sexuality and gender oppression for decades, long before it was popular, long before it was considered to be cute. And I just approach everything that I work on and think about in that way. And when you think about the issue of white supremacy, it's absolutely entwined. Again, much like racial capitalism, it's entwined with patriarchy and with homophobia and transphobia. So you can't really address one without the other. I mean, just like for a thought experiment, what would our country be like if we decided, miraculously decided as a nation to get rid of white supremacy in every possible way that we could, and left violence against women, rape, transphobia, homophobia, discrimination against people based upon gender and sexuality, if we left that intact? What would we have accomplished if we did not look at all those vectors of oppression, all those roadblocks to freedom? And there are many other things, that we can talk about too. We have to look at our international situation. We have to look at our relationship to the rest of the world. We export white supremacy. Your previous guest was talking about the incredible repercussions of the United States' ongoing so-called foreign policy, which is really war policy, and that I think he said there were only 11 years in the entire history of the country when we weren't involved in warfare. What does that say about what kind of nation we are? And so much of that has been racialized. And particularly, I would say since World War II, the skirmishes and they're bigger than skirmishes, the military adventures that this nation engages in just always seems to be against populations of people of color. We could talk about
Barbara,
disability.
before we go, since we just have 30 seconds, I want to ask if you see echoes of the Hamer-Baker plan in the Democratic Party platform, or what's being put forth, and the role you see activists should play in the November election.
I haven't read the platform, but from what I gather, it's coming from a different place, because as I talked about nipping around the edges of the problem, I think that even if they're bold initiatives, you have to have the consciousness. You have to acknowledge and admit that white supremacy exists in order to fight it. And see, that's the difference. There may very well be things in that platform that will help with our situation of vast racial inequality. But is a purpose of those initiatives to address that bedrock system of white supremacy. That's the difference, and that's why I proposed the Hamer-Baker plan.
Well, we're going to link to that plan at DemocracyNow.org. Barbara Smith, author, activist, and independent scholar. Her piece in The Nation, How to Dismantle White Supremacy. When we come back, as global deaths from COVID-19 start to near 1 million, we look at the race to develop a vaccine and the issue of transparency. Back in 30 seconds.
The end of the Reagan era, I'm like Lemma 12, old enough to understand it didn't change forever. They declared the war like a war on terror, but what it really did was let the police terrorize whoever. But mostly black boys, but they would call us and lay us on our belly while they fingers on their boots was on our head, they dogs was on our crotches, and they would beat us up if we had diamonds on our watches, and they would take our monies as they pick our pockets. I guess that's the privilege of policing for some profit. But thanks to
Reagan by Killer Mike. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to look at why AstraZeneca paused its Phase 3 COVID-19 vaccine trial in the United Kingdom, widely considered one of the most promising trials, and what we know. AstraZeneca only revealed initial details during a private phone call between the CEO and the investors, saying a woman in the trial developed severe neurological symptoms consistent with transverse myelitis, or inflammation of the spinal cord. This was first reported by the medical news site Stat. For more, we're joined by Stat senior writer Ed Silverman, whose column this week is headlined, "Everyone Was Left to Guess What Went Wrong," an open letter to AstraZeneca's CEO on transparency. Ed Silverman, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us what you're demanding of the CEO and explain exactly what happened. Many people heard AstraZeneca's trial was halted, that it's doing with the University of Oxford, but not understanding why and how serious myelitis is, whether or not it's connected to this trial.
Well, there's an issue here. First of all, again, thank you for having me. There's an issue here, several issues here. The whole world is watching right now what is happening with vaccine development. And normally when there is a halt in a clinical trial, which is a serious matter typically, a company has to disclose certain developments to regulators, to trial participants, and to investors if it's considered what's called material information, something that could materially affect the business operations. And in this particular case, the company on Tuesday, we reported on Tuesday that the company halted the trial. And at that point, the company let out only a little bit of information and only in response to calls from reporters. On Wednesday morning, the company put out a rather bland general statement calling this situation a routine matter. And at the same time, though, the CEO, as you mentioned, was on a private call with investor clients from JP Morgan. So that raised a whole bunch of issues in my mind because, as I started to say, the whole world is watching this vaccine development right now. And this is in the context of several debatable controversies, one of which is the extent to which the vaccine companies are being pushed to move faster than they should, rather move faster to get a vaccine out as quickly as possible. But at the same time, the FDA is being bullied by the Trump administration, particularly in President Trump, to get a vaccine out there as quickly as possible. And conveniently, he keeps talking about a vaccine before the election. So if you connect the dots, you look at the situation, you say, okay, we've got a pandemic. Most people want a vaccine as quickly as possible. But is the FDA being pushed to authorize or approve a vaccine faster than it should? There are standards that are in place, no matter what, to have safety and effectiveness data. Now, yes, we can't wait years for that to emerge, but we also don't want a vaccine before it's time. And that plays into yet another issue, which is trust. The American people are already divided over vaccines generally, and the anti-vaxxer crowd, as they're called. And now there's growing concern that if the administration, Trump in particular, is trying to get a vaccine out faster than it should be out and is leaning on the FDA to do so, that will have another reason to not trust vaccines. And stepping back, the issue there reflects on AstraZeneca, but also the pharmaceutical industry at large, which has already taken a severe hit with its reputation for the last several years over drug pricing. So instead of thinking of the greater good, and instead of being concerned with these issues, because these are all societal issues, and it's not just the United States. The AstraZeneca CE acted as if it's business as usual. Oh, we may have material information, or maybe he didn't consider it material. But in any event, he released a few more details that selectively to the investor crowd. And what were those details? He indicated that, as you said, the side effect that was discovered in this one trial participant is consistent with transverse myelitis. And that could be a first sign of multiple sclerosis. So
is it also similar to Guillain-Barré?
Right. And we need to know more information about that. Other researchers need to know. Other companies that are using the same vaccine technology or platform, they want to know what's going on. Does this affect them? Does this affect other people's willingness and ability to enroll in one or more clinical trials by that company and others? So there are a lot of implications here. And again, as I said, he treated his business as usual and thinking of the greater good instead of trying to address concerns that can show up with lack of transparency and therefore lack of trust.
So, Ed, we just have a minute, but poll just done says well over 60% of the American population doesn't trust the FDA to approve a safe vaccine, just as President Trump pushes to get this done. He's very open about this before the November election. What do you think is the most important issue, as you're demanding of the CEO of AstraZeneca, to go along a safe path?
Well, I think the companies, not just AstraZeneca, have to continue to adhere to what they've already said in a public pledge released last week, to follow the usual rigorous standards for safety and effectiveness that the FDA pursues. The FDA is not perfect, no agency is, but that's a gold standard. And that is not just for the benefit of the drug companies, but presumably it's a benefit for the public. So I think that's crucial here, and unfortunately, President Trump is not respecting that. And that's why our own Stat Harris poll found that 78% of Americans believe that the vaccine approval is that politics is coming before science when it comes to the vaccine approval process.
Ed Silverman, I want to thank you for being with us, senior writer and columnist at statnews.com. We're going to link to your latest piece, Everyone Was Left to Guess What Went Wrong, an open letter to AstraZeneca's CEO on transparency. That does it for our show, Democracy Now!, produced by a remarkable team led by our general manager, Julie Crosby, Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tiasena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Trina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tay Marie Studio, John Hamilton, Rabbi Karen, Honey Massoud, and Adriano Contreras. Also special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. Wear a mask, save lives.